Carl Jung warned that the most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has gone completely quiet. And when a highly sensitive person reaches what modern interpreters of Jung have come to call the Sophia Stage, that silence is not peace, it is precision. What happens when someone who has spent years absorbing other people's pain finally stops and starts reflecting truth with surgical accuracy? That is exactly what we are going to explore today, and what Jung's framework reveals about this transformation will change how you see silence forever. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche. He mapped the depths of the unconscious, built an entire framework around archetypes, and worked with patients that other doctors had given up on. Jung never used the word empath as we use it. He wrote instead about the introverted feeling type, the highly sensitive individual, the person whose inner world processed emotional information at a depth most people never reached. When we use the word empath in this video, we are applying his framework to a personality type he understood deeply, even if he called it by a different name. And within that framework, there was one transformation that unsettled him more than any other. It was the moment a highly sensitive person stopped being a vessel for other people's pain and became something else entirely. Something most people around them were not prepared for. To understand what the Sophia Stage actually is, you first need to understand what Jung meant by the Anima. The Anima is Jung's term for the deep feminine principle that lives inside every human psyche, regardless of gender. It is not a mood or a feeling. It is an archetypal force that shapes how we experience intuition, relationship, and inner wisdom. Jung described the Anima as developing through 4 distinct levels. The first is Eve, the purely instinctive and biological level. The second is Helen, the romantic and aesthetic level. The third is Mary, the level of spiritual devotion and selfless care. And the fourth, the highest, is Sophia. In ancient Greek, Sophia simply means wisdom. But in Jung's framework, she represented something far beyond intelligence. Sophia was the archetype of integrated wisdom, the level where a person has moved through every earlier form of relating to the world and arrived at something clear, whole, and unshakable. Modern interpreters of Jung have taken this 4th Anima level and applied it specifically to the journey of the highly sensitive individual, the person who has spent years feeling everything, absorbing everything, and enduring everything. When we call it the Sophia Stage in this video, we are drawing on that modern synthesis, rooted in Jung's actual framework, but applied to a personality pattern he would have recognized immediately. Jung described individuation as a lifelong process of becoming your most complete, authentic self. It is not a straight line with a finish line at the end. Jung was explicit about this. It spirals, it circles back, it asks the same questions in different seasons of life, and expects deeper answers each time. But within that spiraling process, certain thresholds do exist. Certain shifts that once crossed do not reverse. And the passage into what we are calling the Sophia level is one of them. Highly sensitive individuals, Jung observed, often enter this process through a very specific kind of pain. They do not choose the path chooses them. And here is something that most people explaining Jung get wrong. The Sophia level is not something you decide to reach. You cannot manufacture it through positive thinking or a weekend retreat. It only becomes accessible after a person has moved honestly through the earlier layers of the psyche. Jung described the persona, the social mask we wear to function in the world. Then the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have buried because they felt too dangerous or too shameful to claim. Then the deeper anima, or animus, the inner voice most people encounter only in dreams, and in the quiet moments they spend most of their lives avoiding. These are not steps on a ladder you climb once and leave behind. They are layers you return to again and again, each time with more clarity. Only through that honest, recurring engagement does the Sophia level become real. She is not a reward for suffering. She is what remains after you have stopped pretending about any of it. That is precisely why so few people reach her, and it is precisely why those who do are impossible to manipulate. Consider a composite profile drawn from patterns Jung observed repeatedly across his clinical work. A person, a woman in this case, who had spent the first part of her adult life absorbing everyone around her. Her mother's anxiety, her partner's moods, her co-workers' frustrations. She was what Jung described as an emotional shock absorber. The kind of person that everyone called when things fell apart. The kind of person who rearranged their own needs to make space for everyone else's. Outwardly, she appeared stable. Inwardly, she was drowning. And crucially, she was watching everything. This is the part that most people miss about highly sensitive individuals. They are not just feeling things, they are recording things. Every micro-expression, every shift in tone, every story that does not quite add up. Their nervous systems are finely tuned instruments, and those instruments do not take breaks. Jung wrote about the introverted feeling type and the intuitive type in exactly these terms. Not passive recipients of emotion, but individuals whose psychic apparatus processed unconscious information at a level most people around them could not detect and did not want to believe. The composite profile continues. For years, this type of person silences herself, not because the data stopped coming in, but because she learned, early and repeatedly, that sharing what she perceived caused problems. People became defensive, relationships became strained, she was labeled dramatic, suspicious, or difficult, so she learned to keep the truth inside. Jung wrote about this dynamic extensively. He described how people with heightened emotional and intuitive perception were often turned into scapegoats by the very systems they were trying to protect. Their clarity threatened the comfortable unconscious agreements that hold dysfunctional groups together, and so they learned to be quiet. But here is what Jung understood that nobody else was saying at the time. The truth does not disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates. And in a sensitive nervous system, it accumulates with extraordinary precision. Every lie gets filed, every pattern gets catalogued. Every time someone's words did not match their behavior, it was noted. Not consciously, necessarily, but stored, the way a computer stores data before it is ever opened. The highly sensitive person in this pre-Sophia period is not a victim. She is a strategist who does not yet know she is one. In the spirit of Jung's framework, we might describe this inner architecture as the opposite of a victim's diary. It is a strategist's war room, quietly filling with evidence, waiting for the moment of activation. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. The Sophia Stage does not arrive on a schedule. It does not come because someone decided to be stronger. It is not the result of therapy alone, or a book read at the right time, or a motivational video. In Jung's clinical observations, and in the composite profiles he built from dozens of similar cases, the Sophia Stage was almost always triggered by a clarity event. A single moment when the weight of accumulated truth became heavier than the need to keep the peace. Consider a narrative illustration based on the patterns Jung documented repeatedly. A person in a long-term relationship begins to notice something. Small things at first. A story that changes slightly each time it is told. A reaction that is too strong for the situation. A look that appears and disappears too fast to comment on. For years, the empath in this illustration files these observations away. She tells herself she is imagining it. She tells herself she loves this person. She tries harder. She is kinder. She apologizes for things she did not do. She has spent so long being told her perceptions are wrong that she has started to believe it. Jung borrowed a term from the anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl to describe exactly this state: participation mystique. It refers to a condition of unconscious identification so complete that a person can no longer distinguish where they end and another person begins. The boundary between self and other simply dissolves. It is not kindness that causes it. It is the gradual erosion of differentiation, the slow loss of the psychological border that should protect the self from being overwritten by someone else's reality. She has not just absorbed the other person's moods, she has absorbed their version of truth. Then one day, something happens, not always a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is something small, a pause before an answer, a text left open by accident, a detail that finally connects two things she had been holding separately for years. And in that moment, every single piece of data she has ever stored comes into focus at once. Not as a flood of emotion, as a map, clear, complete, and impossible to unsee. This is the clarity event, and what follows terrifies almost everyone who witnesses it. Most people expect an empath who has been hurt to fall apart, to cry, to rage, to beg for answers. And that is exactly what abusers, manipulators, and people who rely on an empath's softness are prepared for. They have a plan for emotional chaos. What they do not have a plan for is calm. What they do not have a plan for is someone who already knows everything and has simply decided what to do about it. Jung documented this moment across multiple composite profiles as the most psychologically striking transformation he had ever observed. The empath becomes still, not numb, not cold. Still in the way that water is still before it reveals exactly what is beneath the surface. The nervous system that was once overwhelmed by everyone else's feelings is now organized around one thing only: clarity. Jung wrote that these individuals did not attack or rage. They spoke truth, quietly, precisely, like someone reading a report they had been preparing for a long time without knowing they were writing it. And then they make decisions. That is the part nobody talks about enough. The clarity event is not just an emotional reckoning. It is the opening of what Jung might call the strategic mind. The empath who has reached this threshold does not spiral. She plans. She begins to move quietly through her life, making adjustments that look small from the outside, but are enormous from within. She stops sharing information with people who have proven they will use it against her. She stops softening her observations to protect other people's comfort. She starts choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses an instrument, with purpose, with economy, with complete awareness of exactly what each one will accomplish. The war room we described earlier is no longer waiting. It is open for business. This is the beginning of what Jung called shadow integration, and this is where the Sophia level truly takes root. The shadow in Jung's framework is not a simple thing. It is not just the part of ourselves we were taught to hide. It contains everything the conscious ego has rejected, and that includes the uncomfortable material. The aggression we were told was unacceptable, the selfishness we were shamed out of, the anger we learned to swallow before it could surface. For highly sensitive individuals specifically, the shadow also holds what is particularly important to name: power, the silenced intelligence, the denied strength, the right to say no and mean it and not apologize afterward. Shadow integration is not about becoming a better, gentler version of yourself. It is about becoming a complete version. That means meeting your own capacity for sharpness, for boundary, for the kind of quiet ferocity that comes from someone who has finally stopped pretending to be less than they are. When that whole shadow is integrated, including the parts that feel dangerous, what emerges is not aggression. It is authority. And that authority is what the Sophia level looks like from the outside. It is calm, precise, and absolutely impossible to fake. This is also why the Sophia stage is not about anger, even though it may look that way from the outside. The empath who has reached this stage is not acting out of hurt. She has passed through hurt. She is now operating from something Jung considered far more powerful, which is integrated knowing. She sees through social masks without effort. She is no longer compelled to fix the people she sees through. She is no longer available to absorb pain she did not create. And that, according to Jung, is precisely what makes her dangerous to those who depended on her silence. There is a psychological mechanism that explains this response in others. Jung wrote about it in his work on projection. When someone who has always functioned as an emotional shock absorber suddenly stops absorbing, the people who relied on that function are forced to confront their own unprocessed material. The manipulator who could always redirect blame now finds their redirections reflected back at them. The person who relied on the empath's guilt now finds there is no guilt available to access. The family system that depended on one person carrying everyone else's weight now has to look at the weight itself. This is not aggression on the empath's part, but it is perceived as a threat. And in Jung's observation, the reaction from others is often swift and intense. They push back. They attempt to reinstate the old dynamic. They call the empath cold, or changed, or difficult, or cruel. And the empath, for the first time, does not flinch. Jung identified this unshakable stillness as one of the most recognizable hallmarks of the Sophia stage. He described it as the moment the person stops seeking external permission for their internal reality. They no longer need someone else to confirm what they know. They no longer wait for the person who hurt them to finally admit it. The knowing is enough, and the knowing guides every choice from that point forward. Think about the last time you felt something deeply and then spent enormous energy trying to convince yourself it was not real. That gap between what you knew and what you allowed yourself to believe is the gap the Sophia stage closes permanently. Once it is closed, it cannot be reopened by someone else's insistence. This has a specific and documented effect on the people in the empath's life. Drawing on Jung's work with highly sensitive types, we can describe how integrated individuals in this stage became what we might call selectively empathetic, not less caring, strategically caring. Their love did not disappear. It became directional. They poured it toward people and situations that could receive it without weaponizing it, and they withdrew it, without drama and without apology, from those who had only ever used it as a resource. The people who had been exploiting the empath's openness noticed this shift before anyone told them it had happened. Jung wrote extensively about projection and the way manipulative psychological patterns function. Those who rely on others' softness can sense, often before they can articulate it, when their usual leverage has gone. They cannot always name what changed, but they feel it, and they respond to it with either escalation or avoidance. In either case, the empath is no longer controlled by the response. Now let us talk about the silence itself, because this is the part Jung described as genuinely dangerous, and it is important to understand why. The silence of the Sophia stage is not the silence of someone who has nothing left to say. It is the silence of someone who has decided that not everything deserves a response. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and most people have only ever encountered the first kind. When an empath in the earlier stages of development goes quiet, it is usually because they have been worn down. The silence is exhausted, defeated, full of unexpressed things they were afraid to voice. That silence can be manipulated. It can be filled by someone else's narrative. It can be broken by the right pressure applied at the right moment. The silence of the Sophia stage is different. It is architectural. It is a choice made from clarity, not from fear, and it cannot be filled by someone else's narrative, because the empath already knows the narrative. All of it. In that silence lives everything she has ever observed, every pattern she has catalogued, and every decision she has already made. The abuser who believed her silence meant confusion now faces silence that means completion. She is not trying to figure out what to do. She already knows. She is simply not obligated to perform the process for an audience. Jung believed this form of silence represented a genuinely dangerous shift in social power. Not dangerous in a harmful sense, but dangerous in the sense that it cannot be undone. Once an empath reaches the Sophia stage, once she integrates her shadow and trusts her own perception completely, she cannot be psychologically returned to who she was before. The transformation is permanent, and every person who had built their behavior around the old version of her will eventually have to reckon with that. This is why Jung considered the Sophia stage not just a personal transformation, but a social one. The empath does not change in isolation. Her change forces change in every system she was part of. Families reorganize, relationships clarify. The people who rise to meet the new version of her reveal their own capacity for growth. The people who cannot meet her simply fall away. And in Jung's clinical observations, this falling away was almost always experienced by the empath, not as loss, but as relief. There is a personal opinion I want to offer here, rooted in everything Jung documented and in what we understand about psychological growth. I believe the Sophia stage is not an accident of suffering. It is the inevitable destination of any empath who refuses to fully die on the inside. The years of absorbing other people's pain are not wasted. They are preparation. Every micro-expression catalogued, every pattern recognized, every time the empath silenced herself and kept watching, she was building something. She did not know she was building it, but the architecture was going up regardless. The Sophia stage is simply when the building is finally inhabited, when all of that accumulated wisdom stops being stored and starts being lived. Jung wrote that consciousness evolution does not happen through comfort. It happens through the integration of what we were too afraid to fully feel and too conditioned to fully trust. The empath who reaches the Sophia stage has done both. She has felt everything, and she has learned to trust all of it. That combination, feeling completely and trusting completely, is not common. It is not safe for those who prefer the old arrangement, but it is, without question, the most psychologically complete state a human being can reach. I also want to say something that Jung understood, but rarely stated this directly. The people who fear an empath in the Sophia stage the most are not strangers. They are the ones who spent years depending on her, not knowing how much she knew. They are the ones who got comfortable with her doubt. They are the ones who told her she was too emotional, too sensitive, too much, because keeping her slightly off balance was easier than facing what she could see when she was steady. The Sophia stage removes that leverage permanently, and for people who built entire relationships on that leverage, her steadiness is not just unwelcome, it is devastating, not because she attacks them, but because she no longer needs to. Her simply being whole is enough to dismantle everything they built on her confusion. Consider one more narrative illustration, again built from the composite patterns Jung documented across many cases. A person who had spent 30 years being the emotional center of her family reaches the Sophia stage in her early 50s. She does not announce it. She does not call a meeting. She simply stops doing the things she used to do out of guilt. She stops answering calls designed to pull her into other people's crises. She stops softening her observations to protect other people's comfort. She stops pretending she does not see what she sees. The family system fractures briefly. There are accusations. There is pressure. People who had never examined their own behavior are suddenly forced to, because the person who had always managed the fallout is no longer managing it. Some of them rise to meet the moment. They begin their own work. They begin to see her clearly, maybe for the first time. Others cannot tolerate the exposure and distance themselves. What the composite profile reveals is this: the empath does not grieve the fracture the way she once would have. She recognizes it as the natural consequence of finally living honestly. And the relationships that survive the fracture become the deepest ones she has ever had. This is the resolution Jung pointed toward in all of his work on individuation. Not a life without difficulty, a life without self-betrayal. The empath who reaches the Sophia stage is not invulnerable. She still feels everything. She still notices every shift in a room, still reads the unspoken words behind someone's careful smile. But she no longer confuses feeling everything with having to carry everything. The awareness remains intact. What changes is what she chooses to do with it. She is not less empathetic. She is, as Jung wrote, perfectly empathetic, which means she is finally empathetic toward herself as well. The silence you see in someone at the Sophia stage is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is the silence of someone who has stopped performing their pain for an audience that was never going to acknowledge it anyway. It is the silence of someone who has made peace with knowing what she knows. It is the silence of someone who is no longer waiting for permission to be exactly who she is. And that, as Jung observed, is the most powerful thing a human being can become. Not loud, not aggressive, not dramatic, not performing for anyone who cannot recognize it, just completely, unmistakably, undeniably themselves. The world does not need more people who disappear into everyone else's needs. It needs more people who have done the work Jung described. People who feel deeply and think clearly and move through the world with the quiet authority of someone who has finally stopped pretending. The Sophia stage is not the end of the empath's sensitivity. It is the beginning of her sovereignty. Jung spent his entire career documenting what happens when human beings stop running from their own depth and start living from it. The empath who reaches the Sophia stage is his most complete answer to the question of what psychological wholeness actually looks like. Not perfection, not the absence of pain, just someone who has finally learned to trust the most sophisticated instrument they have ever possessed, which is their own perception, completely and without apology. The silence is not a warning, it is an arrival. It is the quiet signal of a person who has completed something enormous inside themselves. And for anyone paying attention, it says everything. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.